Hello everyone and welcome back to SK Monicus, and this video on analytical mechanics will discuss about the motion of a particle in a central field. In the last video we reduced the two-body problem down to the motion of a particle in a central field. In this video we talk about how the motion of a single particle in a central field really works, and in the next video we move on to the Kepler's problem and we'll actually solve the problem of gravitationally interacting bodies, which can be, we'll say, the earth and the sun. So we know that these are really two bodies, so it's a two-body problem, but from the information that we have now, that this can be solved as the motion of one particle only, such that it moves in a central field. And from this video, the knowledge that we gain, the skills that we gain of solving this particular system, we can in the next video solve how the earth revolves around the sun. So how do we exactly solve this? Well, first of all, write the Lagrangian quite obviously. What is the system here? We have a particle. And it moves in a potential, say, u of r, and this is the center of the field. This particle exists in this external field. External, that's an important thing, because there's a single particle here. There's no other particle whose dynamics we are talking about. There's a single particle. So the field is essentially external. What is the Lagrangian of this particle? Well, we can write the Lagrangian as half mv square minus u of r, the potential energy of interaction of this particle in the external field. We define this to be the center of the field, and from the center of field, r is the distance. It's important that r be the distance from the center of the field. And next, that the potential energy does not depend on the orientation of this particle with respect to any of these axes. It only depends on what distance this particle is from the center of the field. Now, in the video on Noether's theorems, when we talked about the conservation of angular momentum, I said that if you have two particles, or if you have a bunch of interacting particles, and provided that the mechanical system is closed, it does not matter at what orientation in space do you keep them at. So from this fact, that provided that you are in an inertial frame of reference, every direction in space is equivalent, that space is isotropic in an inertial frame of reference. From this fact, we concluded that there should be a corresponding conserved quantity, as Noether theorem states, that for every continuous symmetry of a system, there is a corresponding conserved quantity, or a corresponding conserved current. So which in this case happens to be the angular momentum of the system. And then we can go ahead and define the angular momentum for a single particle. And even if the angular momentum is in a specific case not conserved, we know that if we include all the dynamics, if we include everything in the system, it's again conserved. But maybe if you have a system that is part of an open, well, that is in an open environment and other things are interacting, and you look at this specific thing, maybe the angular momentum is not conserved. So thus we have talked all about this. So here we have a particle, and we are not really talking about the dynamics of the external field itself, about how the field came to be. Maybe there are other particles, there are perhaps electrically charged particles that are causing this potential energy to be there. But we are not talking about their dynamics. We only speak of this particle. So the Lagrangian is that of a particle in an external field. Will the angular momentum be conserved in this case? That's the question. For a closed mechanical system, quite obviously. But this is an open system. And as a matter of fact, the angular momentum should be conserved here, because the criteria of the conservation of angular momentum has to be the fact that every direction in space, provided that we look at things from an inertial frame of reference, well, that is only when this occurs, that every direction in space is equivalent, that the orientation of the system does not matter as to what the dynamics occur. So, and in this case, even if the particle is in an external field, all directions in space are equivalent, because, well, the Lagrangian tells you what the dynamics are. And so if you place this particle here, well, all good. If you were to place it, if you were to keep all the other variables same, let's say the speeds are same, this distance is the same, and what instead you imagine is that if the particle were here, everything would play out exactly the same way, because all the dynamics are encoded in the Lagrangian. So you are only changing the orientation, and the Lagrangian does not explicitly depend on what orientation this particle is at. all directions in space are equivalent. So this case of the motion of a particle in an external central field, so provided that the external field is central, that's well what the video is about, the motion of a particle in a central field. Provided that the field is central, all directions space are again equivalent for this particle, and thus angular momentum of this particle must be conserved. Now there's a caveat here, only angular momentum about this point, because when we are talking about the angular momentum about this point, so we'll see that all directions space are equivalent. If we choose this as the reference point for the calculation of angular momentum, well, all directions are not equivalent, because if the particle were at certain distance here, the potential energy is different. Here the potential energy is different. The potential energy is same when you are at equal distances from this point. It's different at this point and different at this point, because this point is at a different distance to this, and this is at a different distance essentially. So you take any other point, they have different potential energies. So well, all directions in space are well not equivalent for you. They are equivalent. Space really is isotropic in an inertial frame. Well, that's the definition of an inertial frame, I should say again, where space and time are homogeneous and isotropic. So space really is isotropic with respect to this point. So the calculation of angular momentum with respect to this point should tell you that it is a conserved quantity. And it's very important, because we are not actually going to write down the Lagrange equations in this form and solve them. We'll really only use conservation laws to solve this entire mechanical system. That's what we are going to do. Essentially use conservation laws, not use the Lagrange equations in this form. And that tells us the power of conservation laws. So we have the Lagrangian of the system, half mv square minus u of r. We don't know exactly what central field is it. So of course we are going to write the integrals of motion, the integration of the equations of motion, but that will still leave as integrals only. So we are not actually going to go ahead and integrate them down to their purest forms, no, down to their analytical forms. We are considering an arbitrary central field. In the next video we talk about one specific one of them. So what do we do now? How do we exactly solve the system? Well, the problem really tells you that it's way better to work here in polar coordinates than in, say, Cartesian coordinates. But before that, consider this matter, that since the angular momentum of this point of this particle about this point is always conserved, and the motion started with a certain value of angular momentum, say vector m. It started with a certain vector m, that's the angular momentum vector. So it continues with that angular momentum only. Since vector m is calculated about this point, so it's really vector r cross vector v, and we have a single particle, vector p I should say, we have a single particle. You know that these three vectors have to always be perpendicular to each other. I must say not all three of them mutually, but maybe vector r and vector p share the same direction at some point, in which case angular momentum would be 0. But since the fact that it's starting from non-zero value means that they aren't always in the same direction. The point being that vector r is always perpendicular to vector m, and vector p is also always perpendicular to vector m. So that's the point. And so if you consider that the motion starts in one certain plane, say such, and the angular momentum is conserved, not only should its magnitude remain constant, but its direction must also always remain constant. So initially the angular momentum points outward of the board. At all successive times, the angular momentum must also always point out of the board. And the reason is because its direction has to essentially always be the same. It's a central field. Space is isotropic with respect to point, even if the field is external, because, well, again, it is central. So angular momentum, which is a vector, has to be conserved. So not only the magnitude, but the direction should remain constant. And if the angular momentum vector at every point has to point outwards, well, that tells you that this is the kind of plane that the motion is occurring in, that the motion is happening in. So the motion must keep happening in the same plane. This particle cannot move outward or rotate in that respect, because if it were to, the direction of angular momentum must change. So if the rotation were to happen in, say, along this were the plane of motion, if the motion happens about this plane, about this axis, so it continues to happen about that axis. So in the case of a central field, you see that there are really, while solving the equations, two variables involved. So if we consider, let's say Cartesian coordinates x, y and z, and let's say this is the xy plane, we choose this to be xy plane, so the motion happens along the z plane. So the motion, the orbit, the rotation happens about the z plane. So this really only z component to this angular momentum, and that will continue to be so. The particle cannot move in along the z axis, because if it were to do that, the direction of angular momentum would change. So we need to keep its direction constant due to the fact it's in a central field, and that tells you as a fact that the motion can only occur in a plane. So this is really a planar motion. What do we do next? Well, the configuration of the system quite essentially tells you that it's way better to use what do you call this thing? Polar coordinates. It's way better to use polar coordinates in this. So let's switch to polar coordinates. We'll write v square in polar coordinates, so that should go like, and 2-dimension only. We don't have to go like spherical or cylindrical polar coordinates, because we are choosing a single plane in which the motion happens. So this is r dot square, this is r square, phi dot square minus u as a function of r. I choose, say, this to be the direction from which to consider phi. This is phi, this is some distance r. Now the next thing that we know is that polar coordinates really are generalized coordinates here. So you take this single particle, and what does it mean? You can independently move the particle backward and forward along the r-axis, and you can rotate it clockwise or anti-clockwise along the phi axis about this particular line. The next thing that we do is, how about we calculate the generalized momentum? And if I calculate the generalized momentum with respect to the generalized coordinate phi, so that should be partial dl over d phi dot. As you can quite clearly see, this Lagrangian does not contain explicitly phi in it. It only contains phi dot, so it doesn't contain phi explicitly. Was that? Well, that seems to be mr square phi dot. And what is this exactly? Generalized momentum with respect to a polar generalized coordinate. That should be an angular momentum about rotation along that coordinate, which is this, and we have considered this to be the plane of motion. We define it to be such because it only occurs in a single plane. So along this plane of motion and this rotation, the corresponding generalized momentum, which is an angular momentum corresponding to this rotation, should really be the angular momentum of the system. Let's call it mz. So you figure that this generalized momentum corresponding to the generalized coordinate phi is the angular momentum about the z-axis. Let's call it mj. And we know that it's a constant. The angular momentum is a constant for the given case. This is one important result we have. We know what the angular momentum is in terms of r and phi dot, and we know that it's a constant. The next thing that we do is, we know that the Lagrangian does not explicitly contain time in it. So the energy should also be a constant, which actually makes sense if we look at the system. So the field which is external is only depends on this r here explicitly, but it does not depend on time explicitly. If the system were a complete closed mechanical system, energy is quite obviously conserved. If it's in an open environment, it is in general not conserved. But when there is no explicit time dependence of the interaction between this open system and its environment, it's again conserved. When you include the energy of the external field, which is this here. So what's the energy here? Well, the kinetic energy of the particle, half m r dot square plus r square phi dot square plus u of r, and it's also a constant. Now keep in mind that the integrals of motion, the conserved quantities, again if I were to distinguish, integrals of motion are any such constants, that any such variables that can be written in terms of the dynamical variables that remain constant throughout the motion. And the conserved quantities are specifically these ones that follow directly from the homogeneity and isotropy of space and time. So these quantities like energy and angular momentum and linear momentum are said to be conserved quantities. There are other variables, one of which we'll later study, that can remain conserved aside from these, but these are the special ones. So it's not much of an important distinction what you call them. So these integrals of motion, their values are decided by the initial conditions of motion. I have also explained that. So how the system begins it, or at what time you consider it to begin, well, that's how you decide the value of the angular momentum or the energy, which are constant. So provided that we want to solve the integrals of motion, we of course must know what the initial dynamics of the system were, how this and what configuration and what speeds all these particles had initially. So that really means that we know what initially E and mz are, and that means that it's valid to express our answers in terms of capital E or mz, right? If you don't know explicitly for a given mechanical system what capital E or mz are, well, you can simply find out from these expressions. Let's say you know initially what the distance r is, or what phi dot is, or what r dot is. Since you need to know all generalized coordinates and velocities, how about you just find the energy correspondingly? So it's valid to express the answers in terms of energy and mz, the angular momentum, because they reflect the initial conditions of motion. They are directly chosen by the initial conditions of motion. So the next thing that we do is, this is a constant, that is a constant. What should I do? Well, here we have half mr square phi dot square. Keep in mind there's a square here. I know mr square phi dot. What's that? Well, how about this, that I square both sides of this equation. So we now have m squared r to the 4th power phi dot squared is equal to mz squared, and now I divide the entire equation by mr square. So that tells me mr square phi dot square is equal to mz square over, what did we do, mr square. And now I know what mr square phi dot square is in terms of mz, which is really a constant decided by the initial conditions, and r, which is the variable we'll try to solve for now. So you write the constant energy E is equal to half mr dot squared plus half mr square phi dot squared plus u of r, and we have figured out this term. We have figured out mr square phi dot square, so this is really mz squared over 2mr squared. So the energy is half mr dot squared plus mz squared over 2mr squared plus u of r. And here we have the only variable involved here really is r. Well, I should say there's also r dot, but now we are going to write it as dr over dt and perform an integration. So you can clearly see what we have done here. First, we used the conservation of angular momentum because of Noether's theorem, because all directions in space are equivalent with respect to this point. We found that angular momentum about this point is conserved, and used the conservation of its direction, the constancy of its direction, to establish that the motion is really in a plane. So this is how we have been reducing the coordinates all along, choosing to work in polar coordinates, which are the generalized ones here. Let's say we had chosen r, theta and phi. Let's say we had spherical polar coordinates, and theta were to establish were to tell you where the particle is about this axis. So we figure that the constancy of angular momentum tells you that the motion is along a plane, so we don't need 3 coordinates, we merely need 2. So that is r and phi. The next thing that we have done is we used the conservation of angular momentum, and that told us that this entire thing over here equals the angular momentum and it must remain a constant, and that helps us express one of these in terms of the other, because this entire expression is a constant. It tells you one of these variables, one of these two variables in terms of the other. And then we had energy, which is again a constant by Noether's theorem, and we used that expression, fit it into this, and now we have an entire expression that has R as a variable. So we can now use this energy conservation, we can go ahead and perform the integration, and that should tell us R as a function of time, because that's what the derivative is in, or time as a function of R, and that will help us have completely solved the problem. There's another thing to talk about regarding that, which I'll do after solving this. What do we do? Let's try 2 over m, but before that let's see plus u of r. I should write u of r here, multiply by 2. No, let's first pull this over. E minus u of r, and then multiply by 2 divide by m should be r dot squared plus multiply by 2, it cancels out this, divide by m, and z squared over m squared r squared. Pull this here, r dot squared, so simply r dot is equal to 2 over m e minus u of r minus m z squared over m squared r squared whole under a square root. Next we can write this thing as dr over dt. Remember, r is a variable here. If we wish to perform the integration, you need to keep all the r's one side, so it's really a separation by separation of variables. Pull t upwards, so this gives you, and then integrating in t is equal to this integral dr over square root of 2 over m e minus u of r minus mz squared over m squared r squared, and plus an arbitrary constant. So plus an arbitrary constant, in fact you can always choose that constant to be a 0 depending on when you define the initial moment on time. So let's just ignore that. Focus on this relationship, because that constant can anyway be chosen to be 0. What exactly is this equation? Well, this tells you what is the time needed to go from one well position to another. And so that basically tells you how the motion along the r direction happens, because what we really intend to find out is where this particle can be at any given moment in time, or the other way around. You have the particle at a given position, so at what time instant is it there? So if you know at what instant you start your clock, and you know at that instant what the initial conditions of motion are, where the particle initially is, what is its velocity, and that can also help you find what the energy of the particle is, which remains constant throughout the motion, or what the angular momentum is. So these really are constants here, this capital E and this capital MZ. So you can find out what time it takes to go to any other point, and so you basically know at any point, at any time where the particle is, or at any point what time is it really on the clock. So that establishes, that tells you everything about the motion along the r direction, and that is r direction. We have really solved only for r here, because well, this is u of r over here, this involves r, this involves an integration of r, this is a relation between the distance r and time. We still need to figure out at any given moment, or at any for any value of r, at what orientation the particle is, what is this angle phi, and once we have done that, we have knowledge about the complete motion of this particle. But first of all, you need to appreciate this relationship. So this fully explains to you what the dynamics are along the r direction, or I should say what the kinematics are. This has to do with the dynamics. What do we do next? Well, we take up that thing again, that is that mz is equal to mr square phi dot. And now that we know that this is a constant, now we know what r can be at any given moment in time, or vice versa. You can always perform the integration, have it as a function of r, and inverse the expression, find the inverse function. And then you know r is a function of t, not just t as a function of r. So they are pretty much equivalent things. Now that we know this, we can write this thing as mr square d phi over dt. If I simply express phi in terms of r, I know at any given moment what the angle phi is. That also establishes the complete kinematics along the direction phi, because we know what the motion along r is. So all we have to do is express the motion along phi in terms of the motion along r. And we know that this thing is a constant. So d phi is really equal to mz over mr squared dt. And we know what dt is. It was this differential, this integration aside. So that tells me that I need to replace this dt here and integrate over phi, and we'll get an arbitrary constant that I'll again choose to ignore it, because you can always set the constant as 0, or you can choose that whatever this constant will give you, that plus that will account for that. So phi over here is mz over mr squared. Inside this we have, and then we have it in terms of dr, so it's dr mz over mr squared over the square root of 2 over m e minus u of r minus mz squared over m squared r squared. And now in terms of r, we have figured out where the particle, in what direction in space is it in any given moment. Since these two are sufficient details to tell you where the particle is, so we have them as integrals. For any specific potential energy, we can do the integration, we can evaluate the integral, and we can find the particle. And so the problem is solved. This is how you solve it. We have not explicitly used in the Lagrange equations anywhere. We did not write the Lagrange equations that the time derivative of the generalized momentum is equal to the, well, what is it? Is the time derivative of the generalized momentum is equal to the generalized force on the particle. We have not used that explicitly anywhere. We simply exploited conservation laws. First, we had 3 coordinates because a single particle, so 3 degrees of freedom. We figured out that it really is 2 degrees of freedom because angular momentum's direction's consistency. So you eliminate one of them. Then we figured out that it is also constant in magnitude because, well, again it's conserved. So we have written one in terms of the other, and we figure that energy is also conserved. So the fact that we had 2 equations and 2 variables, we use them simultaneously and solve for both of them, right? So that establishes the kinematics of this. Next, what do we do? Well, we write the angular momentum thing again, and we can derive a neat relation here. What part should I raise? I think this will. I'll write this thing here just in case. T is equal to the integral dr over square root of 2 over m e minus u of r minus mz squared over m r squared. Is it m squared r squared? M squared r squared. Alright, we take this out. I think I'll keep this here. So next, a point about the angular momentum thing, then I'll elaborate on this once more again and tell you what if we worked in a non-inertial frame, what if we are rotating with the particle. Firstly, you see that the angular momentum is conserved. This quantity mr squared phi dot. If you look at the trajectory of this particle, it isn't necessary that the particle goes in a circle. It could have any orbit, and in general it has some arbitrary orbit. So let's consider that this were the trajectory of this particle. This is, well, the center of the field. This is the distance at a given instant, distance r, and at some time later, and this is an infinitesimal angular displacement later. The particle is here. What is the area of the sector? So the particle is at this point, and you characterize this point by this distance and some orientation, say this orientation. Then the particle moves a little infinitesimal displacement here. This is an infinitesimal displacement. So this infinitesimal displacement, it really doesn't change r much, does it? Because it's infinitesimal, and that's an angular displacement. Let's call it d phi, and it's over here. What is the area that this sector that the position vector of this particle has swept from this point to this point? Well, the area should be, well, half, because it looks very much like a triangle, so I could use the triangular area law. It should be half this weight r times this height, and then you figure what is this height. Since this is really an infinitesimal displacement, I may for one approximate this thing as a triangle, and for other part I can also use this law that if it were an arc of a circle, and this is r and this is r and this is d phi, that this should be r d phi. And so it's half times this r times r d phi. So this is really half r squared d phi. And next, this is the area that the, well, position vector has swept, half r squared d phi. Area, let's call it f. In fact, it's an infinitesimal area, keep that in mind, so let's call it df. If we talk about the area in a given finite time duration, we'll call that, say, f, and the infinitesimal area in an infinitesimal time duration, that's df. What is the rate at which area is being swept? So what is the instantaneous velocity of area? So it isn't linear velocity or angular velocity we are really talking about. The rate at which area is being swept. So and these are infinitesimal, so you simply divide by dt, and so d phi over dt, that's really phi dot. Well, that's a matter of notation anyways. This is half r squared phi dot. This is the areal velocity, is also called the sectorial velocity or the sector velocity of this given particle. What does the conservation of angular momentum tell us? mr squared phi dot is a constant. This area really is half r squared phi dot. What is the relation between the angular momentum and the sector velocity? Well, you have, for starters, we have a half here. We don't have a 2 here, but we have a half here, not here. But then we have a mass. So if I simply multiply this expression by 2 and by m, I should get this thing. I should get the angular momentum. So that tells us that mz, the angular momentum, is 2 times the mass of the particle times the area at which, times the rate at which it sweeps the area, which is f dot, and that is a constant, because angular momentum is a constant. Since the particle doesn't quit, obviously change its mass mid-journey, so that tells you that if this entire expression is a constant, this f dot is in itself a constant. And what does that mean? That is, the particle sweeps equal areas in equal time intervals, and that is irrespective of where the particle initially is, where you start the motion from. If it sweeps some, let's say, delta f amount of area and delta t amount of time starting from here, you could as well start from here, and you talk about delta t of amount of time, it will still sweep delta f amount of area. So it does not matter where it starts from, equal areas in equal intervals of time. And you recognize that as Kepler's, as I recall, second law, that's Kepler's second law, that planetary orbits sweep the line, a line drawn from the sun to each of the planets. It sweeps equal areas in equal amounts of time. So the areal velocity of the sectorial velocity of planets are well constant. Why is that? Because the mutual force of interaction between the planets and the sun is a central one. It's a central force. And for any central force, the angular momentum must remain a constant. And the angular momentum remains a constant. That tells you, since the fact that the angular momentum can be expressed in terms of the sectorial velocity, the sectorial velocity must be a constant, which is why Kepler's second law is true. So we have actually proved Kepler's second law here. right? So one by one we have been talking about these fields and these forces, and we have been going to prove on these different velocities. We have in a way kind of proved Kepler's third law as well, that the square of time periods must depend on the cube of the linear dimension. We used the fact from mechanical similarities, from scale transformations. We figured that out. Though we'll go ahead and talk about that when we talk in the next video about Kepler's law one more time and more firmly establish that thing. Alright, we have actually firmly established that. We talk it in a specific context of gravity, and we have proved here, well, Kepler's second law, that this is true, and that this is true not just for gravity but for any central field. Any central field, this must be true. What's next? Well, we have figured this, we have figured this. The next thing that we should talk about is this term here. I'll just erase this thing and let's rewrite the expression for energy. Do we need the Lagrangian anymore? Don't think so. So we take this out, we take this out, and I'll rewrite this expression here just in case. Phi is equal to integral dr m over mz over mr squared over the square root of 2 over m e minus u of r minus mz squared over m squared r squared. We write the total energy of the system once again, and this is half m v squared, which can be written as r dot squared plus r squared phi dot squared. So let's separate them. Half m r dot squared plus half m r squared phi dot squared, and then plus the potential energy of interaction with the external field. We figured that according to angular momentum conservation, this term can as well be replaced with mz squared over 2mr squared. And once we did this, the motion was this entire equation spoke of the direction r only. It's about motion in r, and the corresponding equation that we derived talks merely about the motion in r, and then we use the relation again to talk about the motion along phi. So what you can think of this is that if this is really the total energy of the system, and once I write it in this form, I can remove any discussion about phi dot. I can just neglect the motion in phi, because this equation is telling me merely about what the motion along the direction r is. That is how not how the particle rotates, but how it comes towards the axis and how it goes away from the axis. So how but I think of this is that I refuse to believe that there's any rotation here, there's any phi. We merely talk about how the particle goes away from the point, or how it comes towards the point. But we cannot really do so, because along phi, the motion along phi, depends on the motion along r. So we cannot really do that. However, if instead of this potential, I chose to write this entire term as the potential. So you see what I am doing, and not in terms of phi, because we want to remove all that discussion about the motion along phi, but in terms of this quantity which involves r. It involves the angular momentum. How do you know that's the angular momentum? You can say that because this is really a constant, so it does not worry us. This is a constant throughout the motion. So I can write that what if the energy of the particle is energy of the system, the particle plus the external field, something like half m r dot squared plus an effective potential, a function of r, because this only depends on r. This only depends on r right here. When you express it such, this is a constant, this is a constant, even though it looks like it's depending on phi dot, but you know phi dot depends on r in that way. So this is an effective potential. So the particle's motion along r only, you choose to neglect the motion along phi, is as if the particle were not moving under this potential, but under this potential, under this effective potential. And this is a very useful concept. Plus mz squared over, what is it, 2m r squared, where this is the effective potential. And why is this a useful concept? Because we have separated the two directions of motion entirely. We have essentially separated it. Once we did that, we can see that you can only talk about the motion along r without thinking about what is happening along phi dot, along phi, and then you can externally go ahead and bring this relationship again. And once you have completely solved the case for r only, as we have done in this case, that's what we essentially did, wrote it in terms of r. Now we are merely formalizing it. That's what we have already done, wrote it in terms of r and then talked about phi after having solved this solved. Now we can use this relation, we can solve this too. So it's useful to think, to restrict yourself in one direction at a time. So the particle moves in this direction as if that's the only direction it really moves in. But now this is not the only potential that the particle interacts with. This is not the only field that the particle interacts with. The particle's motion along this direction is as if additionally to this potential energy, there was also this amount of potential energy. And this potential energy is also radial only, it's central. Because this is a constant, it only depends on r and inversely squared to r. So this is essentially a constant here. So you can clearly see what we are trying to do. We are trying to establish the equations of motion purely in terms of r. But how can we imagine this thing to be happening, the particle only moving along this direction? Well, how about we rotate at the same rate as the particle? We could do that we rotate at the same rate that the particle is rotating at any given moment. So if you want an intuition for how this is happening, so what we basically do is, let's say you have the particle and you're sitting over here, because this is the point where we are calculating everything from. You sit over here, let's say in a chair, in a rolling chair, in a spinning chair, and as you watch the particle and it's clearly rotating, so you rotate at the same rate at any given instant. You watch the particle rotating, circulating, this changing the angle phi. And then when you do that and at each instant the particle is right in front of you, you will only observe the particle's motion radially. You will observe how fast it is going away or how fast it is coming in from you, coming in towards you. That is the only motion you'll observe. But while you do so and you neglect this motion towards phi and you only care about this motion along r, you will figure that the particle no longer moves as if there were only this potential energy involved. The particle moves as if there was an additional this potential energy involved. And then you figure that where does this potential energy come from? And then you figure that, well, you yourself are rotating with this particle, and rotation, a rotating frame of reference is a non-inertial frame of reference, because when it's rotating, well, any point over here is circulating. Let's say this is the area you occupy, any point here is circulating, and it has a centripetal acceleration. Accelerating frames are non-inertial, because then they will see any other body and that will instantaneously accelerate without any, well, interaction involved. So they are non-inertial frames. So when you choose to talk about the particle's motion only along r, that has to essentially be, according to that, the frame that you're establishing here always rotates at the same rate as the particle, and that means it's a non-inertial frame. And that is why even without any interaction involved, there's an additional potential energy term for the particle. So even if the frame is essentially non-inertial, well, the frame is essentially non-inertial, you can still use energy conservation, and we have used angular momentum conservation, because we did that first and then we turned to this. So the particle's motion along r is purely, can be written down without reference to phi if you know what your mz are. So which has to do with how the motion started. You know how the motion of the particle started, you know what mz is. Those are part of that is part of the initial conditions. So you can talk simply about the motion along r as if the particle were moving only along r, but under this potential energy, which is why it's called effective potential energy. And since this term comes from the centrifugal effects, As I have explained, I presume you know what centrifugal force is. So this is really the term that corresponds to centrifugal forces. This is called the centrifugal energy. Centrifugal potential energy, if you like to call it, because it's part of the effective potential energy. It's called the centrifugal energy of this system. And the advantage of this is that we can now, with the addition of centrifugal energy, we can ignore any other things, any other caveats involved. We can just ignore entirely those things, and we can simply talk about the motion along R at any given moment. So what do we do now? Well, how about, what was the centrifugal energy again? It was mz squared over 2mr squared. This is the centrifugal energy. If I take this term in here alongside this, so I'll have to multiply and divide 2 and 2 up and down. And what will that give me? That will give, and also an m, because there's an m here but only an m square. So this will be now minus u of r minus mz squared over 2mr squared if I took this under the brackets. So minus u of r minus this thing, which is the centrifugal energy. So that's minus u of r plus this thing, and this makes the effective potential. So it's as if the particle's motion can be entirely explained along the r direction, as if it were not moving under ur potential, but it were moving under an effective potential of r. And once you have established this, since we know that conservation of angular momentum is valid and this equation is valid, we can do the same thing in this equation, and we can see that the particle's motion along r is completely defined by the effective potential energy, as if it were effectively moving in this direction only under this potential. And once you know that and you want to calculate, well, the particle's actual motion, you have figured this out, what this direction of motion is, but then you want to go back and you want to figure out how to relate this motion with this motion, then you can do the same. And you do the same in this equation, is as if the particle really is moving only along this direction under this potential energy, and this also tells you how it really moves even in this direction. So that's how useful this concept of effective potential energies. And even for the next discussion that we are going to do now, we are going to talk about these reference frames wherein we choose the ideas of effective potential energy. And how is that? Well, let's talk about a particle considering whatever kind of orbit. It could be a circular orbit, it could be an elliptical orbit, depends on the kind of field, depends on exactly how the potential energy depends on r. We know the form of the effective potential energy exactly, it's always inverse the square r, and mz being a constant, so that's really a constant. So what was next? We can look at the particle in such a frame, and we want to talk about its motion along r only. So let's say you have some arbitrary potential and the particle moves along r, and you watch it stop at some point. Let's say you watch the particle stop at some point. So dr over dt is 0 at that point. What would that mean? Since we know that essentially in one-dimensional motion, the system's motion is effectively one-dimensional in this case, when we watch the particle to be moving under this effective potential. So the motion has been effectively turned into one-dimensional motion. For one-dimensional motion, you remember, let's say this was some potential energy of yours. So, and it keeps falling downward. This is, let's say, some r, and we are talking about one-dimensional motion. This is u, some arbitrary potential, general case, and this is the energy the system possesses. So these two are turning points, you are well aware. If the particle continues to go this way, you know this is the forbidden region of motion, this is forbidden region, this is forbidden region, this is forbidden region, this small one here. Over here there's only one turning point, so if the particle is to come to this point, it will again come until this point and go back. So there's infinite motion in this direction, forbidden region, two turning points. Here motion is possible, but here are two turning points. Let's analyze this motion, two turning points. The particle essentially stops at these 2 points. It will always stop at these 2 points, and the motion in this direction will be oscillatory. So where there's one turning point, it means an infinite motion, because the particle will continue to move in the other direction. Where there are two turning points, it means an oscillatory motion. It continues to forever go between these 2 points. Since this motion is effectively a one-dimensional motion, let's talk about that one-dimensional motion along R only. If there is one point where the particle comes the closest to the center, let's say that the particle goes as such and you are watching it come close and go farther away. If there's one point that the particle comes to the center and it essentially stops there, that's one point where the particle stops coming towards you, then you know that R velocity is 0 in that case. You know it has 0 kinetic energy, and at this point the total energy of the system, that is capital E, must equal the potential energy of interaction. The particle has 0 kinetic energy there and it stops there. So if it stops, it must again turn back, because that would mean that the potential energy in the forward direction is falling. The potential energy towards higher R falls. That's the only way it could have stopped coming towards you, because if it were to fall to closer to the center, that would mean it would keep accelerating, it would keep coming towards you. So the potential energy in this direction falls, and so as it moves, this kinetic energy in this direction increases. So this would mean a turning point. You watch the particle coming towards you, it stops somewhere, that is essentially a turning point, and R dot at that point is 0. And it's possible, that's possible when the energy of the system, which is essentially a constant, equals the effective, it's important, not the potential energy, because you are essentially watching only this motion, only the motion along R, equals the effective potential energy at this point. Let's call this point R naught. And let's say that the particle continues to forever move outwards. So what would that mean? That means it's an infinite motion, as in this case. So this really is effectively a one-dimensional motion. So we can draw a complete analogy of this. And now the next thing you can consider is that as it goes farther out, maybe it stops at even at this place. And how is that possible? If the potential energy were to be falling in that direction, if it continues to fall, the particle should continue to move outside. Well, because the effective potential energy is written such, it involves the external potential energy plus it involves this term. Maybe you can arrange this external potential energy. What was this? Was 2, there was 2 here? Yes, there was, I suppose, 2. You can always arrange this potential energy to be such so that it keeps falling in some region over here. It falls and maybe it starts rising again. So it falls to a certain point, the potential energy. I'm trying to draw the potential energy here. It's certain point, and after a minimum it starts rising up again, up until this point. So that could be possible. And so if you consider that the potential energy falls only up to this point, so this is not where it falls. Let's say that the potential energy falls up until this point, and then it starts rising from this point. Or maybe it starts rising somewhere earlier, but as it starts rising and rising, the potential energy at this point becomes again equal to the potential energy at this point, which is the total mechanical energy of the system. So it only falls up to a minimum over here and does not fall indefinitely. And it starts rising after a certain point, and it rises up to capital E once again. So once it does that, that would mean that this also has to be a turning point. So that is another turning point. And if you look at this expression, so in that case this expression should give you two solutions for R naught. So you write it in terms of R and you try to figure out for what R naught this must equal capital E, and you should get two solutions because there are two such points that are turning points. And what will that tell you? The particle essentially stops here, and since the potential energy had to rise in this direction, it has to fall in the reverse direction, and so the particle comes over here and it gains kinetic energy and it keeps gaining until it reaches this point. So the effective motion along the direction r is essentially oscillatory for two turning points. If there are 2 points where the effective potential energy equals the total energy, then that's an oscillatory motion along the direction r. If the potential energy afterwards, well, if it were not to rise after this point, it were to keep falling, so that's an infinite motion. All right. There's another thing. What if the potential energy, well, let's say there was no turning point here, there's only a maximum distance over here, there's only a maximum point over there, the particle can only go so much farther away, and there's only a turning point here. So the potential energy keeps dropping, and the particle falls to the center of the field. So that's what should happen. So we talk about this oscillatory motion, and we can figure out by solving this equation with the proper what the effective potential is, given what the central field potential is, we can figure out how many turning points there are. Can there be more than 2 turning points? Well, there can certainly be, because this could be a cubic equation. This could be a cubic equation. Let's say this is somehow proportional to r. This is proportional to r. So as you add them up, you have an r cube over here, and that equals some other expression in r. So it's a cubic equation. It could have 3 solutions. Well, so how about this, that other than this, the potential, it rises over here and then it again falls, and falls such that the potential energy effective at this point equals the total energy again. So this is then a forbidden region, because at these 2 points, even though this is a turning point, at these 2 points the particle cannot traverse this journey, it cannot travel between these 2 points, because everywhere along the journey the potential energy will be higher. But how about this, that there's another turning point? So for such, this has to be such that it depends on directly on an r squared, so that it would be a 4th order equation, for to have 4 solutions. So, and at this all points the particle's potential energy is lower, and at these 2 points equal to the total energy. So motion along these 2 are also possible, and it will be an oscillatory motion between these 2 points. So how do you figure whether the particle travels between these 2 points, oscillates always between these 2 points? Well, you figure that out from what the initial energy is, from what the initial conditions are. If initially the particle were in this region, then it is an oscillatory motion along this. If it were in somewhere in this region, it's an oscillatory motion about this point. That's how you figure it out. Next, even when there's a turning point, the particle doesn't actually stop. It stops coming towards the center or going away from the center. It actually doesn't stop, because it keeps rotating. The particle is really, it's an effective motion in one dimension, not an actual one, because it will keep rotating. So r dot equals 0 does not necessarily imply that phi dot also equals 0. It would keep oscillating. It only stops coming towards or away from you. And what that means is that the path of the particle, the trajectory it follows, let's say it's a finite motion, and whenever that's a finite motion, it has to essentially be oscillatory in this. It does not essentially mean that it's a complete oscillatory motion, that the particle always comes back to the same points. There are possible motions where it's not. In fact, an arbitrary potential energy will give you that. As such, that let's say you talk effectively only about the motion along r, it will always travel through any point in this, along this. Let's ignore the higher order terms. There's not even higher order terms. Consider that these 2 are the only possible turning points. The particle along this direction will traverse through all these points, indefinitely, infinitely, right? It's a finite motion, but for infinite time. It will keep traveling through the same points. So that's an oscillatory motion. It's a closed curve. But the particle also rotates. So if you talk effectively about this, that's the case, but the particle also rotates. So for the particle to pass through the same points over and over again after some time period, that's the definition of time period, to pass through the same point after complete motion once again. So for the particle to pass through the same point, it has to be essential that when, let's say, the particle passed through this point at once, when a complete rotation of 2 pi radians or 4 pi radians or some 6 pi radians happens, so when a complete rotation happens, the particles distance along the r must be also the same as initially. So if phi naught was, if let's call this distance r naught, if the particle was initially r naught, and when do we say that the particle's motion is closed? It's a closed curve. It's a finite motion because it doesn't fly off to infinity. That's what we are talking about. The particle's rotation along phi is quite obviously always finite. That's finite because it passes through 2 pi radians and then does again. When we say infinite motion, means it can fly off to infinity or that it comes from infinity. But here are turning points on r, so it cannot. So we are talking about a finite motion. So for any given finite motion, it's not necessarily that the trajectory is closed one, finite, but it could be an open trajectory, because if this was the distance r at some phi naught, if the particle were at a distance r when it was at an orientation phi naught, after the particle makes a rotation of 2 pi radians about this point, about this axis, and when it makes a rotation of 2 pi radian, the particle should have to come down at the same point r naught. So phi naught plus 2 pi, at this rotation, after this rotation, the particle should again come at r naught, and then the motion would be closed. Then the particle were to be moving in a closed curve. That is, maybe the particle will start it from here and goes through this sort of motion, and it comes back to this point. So if after this whole rotation the particle again comes to exact same r naught distance, then the motion is in a closed curve. This is that closed curve. This is the trajectory of the particle. But that's not necessary. When is that the case? That is only the case when you write phi in terms of, well, that integral. How about we do this? That we write what the change in phi is. Let's consider this r naught to be here, because that would simplify things a lot. That would really simplify things. How come? Well, because then we can say that this is the minimum distance between the particle and the center. It comes this closest to the center. So this is the minimum distance between it and the center. This is the maximum distance. And let's say this r naught point is this minimum distance we are talking about. So when the particle is at whatever orientation and it is at this r naught distance, so for the curve to be closed, so this is the kind of motion that's happening. For the curve to be closed, it has to essentially be the case that the particle after 2 pi rotation must again come to this r minimum distance. And so how about what change in it made in the angle phi during this time? We calculate via that integral because it's a relation. And what change did it make? Well, it's an integral from in r minimum, which it was at initially, to r minimum. But then you figure out that there's a caveat involved here. This integral would right away give you 0, and that is from the same point to the same point. This would give you 0. So you have to figure that what next do we do? How about this? That the change, that the particle goes from this point to this point, and the angle that the particle traverses to this, from this point to this point, and these 2 points need not necessarily lie at the same phi, because when I wrote this, drew this line, I was talking about the effective motion along phi. This could be somewhere here. So there's an essential rotation involved. So when the particle goes from r minimum to r maximum, the angle that it traverses must be the same that the angle that the particle traverses to go from r maximum back to r minimum, because all directions are equivalent. Not only that, the times are equivalent. So to go from r minimum to r maximum, the time, say, that it took is exactly the equal time interval if all the direction of time were to reverse and the particle then goes from r maximum to r minimum. Right? So due to the isotropy of time and due to the isotropy of space, that these two directions, that these 2 points in space are, well, directions in space are equivalent. So the angle traversed to go from this to this is the same angle traversed from that to back. So we can write that the total angle traversed to go from this to this and back to this is twice the angle traversed to go from this to this. And this is R minimum to R maximum, and then we can write the integrand. E minus the effective potential energy. And you figure out this integral. Now for the particle, if this is a complete, let's say we're talking to go from R minimum to R maximum, and then you multiply it by 2, right? And this is what angle the particle will traverse to go from R minimum and to come back to the same minimum distance to the origin. When this is 2 pi radian, then only then the particle can come to the same distance at the same orientation, because you know that the orientation phi naught and the orientation phi naught plus 2 pi is equivalent, because 2 pi simply means you rotate the entire thing and back to the same point. So if you want this to be at the same distance from here, you also need it to be at the same orientation, and only when the two quantities are same is the particle at the same point in space from which it began, and then only is the trajectory of motion a closed curve. But then it could also as well be a 4 pi, and so the particle does not necessarily after covering 2 pi radians come back to this point, but maybe after 4 pi radians or after 6 pi radians. So maybe after n revolutions, after m revolutions, the particle comes back to the same point. So it could be any 2 pi times n, right? So you figure that this integral, this delta phi, you must be able to write this in this form of 2 pi m over n. And what does that mean? I think you understand this thing mathematically, that if you can write this angle traversed in this form, that means that after m revolutions about the same points, the particle has gone through n such, what does it mean? I think to interpret that expression mathematically, so after m time periods, so it's essentially an effective time period for this effective motion, does the particle go through n such radians, n such 2 pi radians, n such complete revolutions and get down to the same point. So if you can write this in the form of delta phi is equal to 2 pi m over capital M, then you know that the particle's trajectory is closed, and from which point it starts, it comes back exactly to that same point. So it's an essential that the integral you should be able to write such. But can you, because this is an integral and it depends on the kind of potential energy of interaction that you are using. We know what the effective potential energy is in terms of the centrifugal energy. We don't know exactly what form of potential energy that we are using. So it depends on the kind of field, and the only thing that we have been doing now is presume that there's a central field, and we have been deriving the equations for that. That's what we are doing. So for different potential energies, this integral gives you different results. Is it true that you can always write as such? Not necessarily. An arbitrary effective potential energy will not give you this. There are only very specific dependence of u on r that will allow this phase rotation, this orientation rotation, whatever you call it, angular rotation, to be written in this form. Very specific potential energies. And what that means, that in general, in a motion in a central field of this particle, the particle does not come back to the same point. It comes back to the same r minimum distance, but then the phi's are not the same, and it goes back to the same r maximum distance, the phi's are not the same. Similarly, after making a complete revolution, after getting back to the same orientation, maybe the distance of the particle from the origin is not the same. So it makes one revolution, the particle is now here, not here, and it makes another revolution, it could be here, not here. So in general, this cannot be written in terms of 2 pi m over n. Thus, in general, the particle's motion is not closed. How do we try to figure that? I'll keep this expression here. How do we try to figure that? maybe this is the central field, and the particle comes in from such, this is some r maximum distance, r minimum distance. The particle goes, well, let's say that this is the kind of motion the particle is making. It comes down to this r minimum distance, but then it starts going away again because there's a minimum distance it can come to, and it goes away such. And then this is the r maximum distance. It does not necessarily go back to the same point. That's not a necessary. If you talk about such dependencies, that the kind I'm doing, so it goes to here, right? And what next? It has gone to the same maximum distance. These two distances are same. It starts coming down again, and maybe it passes through this same point, but then it will, or maybe it goes something like this, same minimum distance, and then goes upward again, then comes downward again, goes upward again, comes downward again, and it continues to do so. So you can essentially draw this circle. You could essentially draw the circle around the center of the field, and the radius of the circle is the minimum distance the particle can come to. That is the closest to the center, and you could draw a circle outside, and the radius of this circle is the maximum distance the particle can get to. Are these always essentially circles? Well, that's a matter of fact, yes. The particle's entire motion lies between these two concentric circles. And why is it always, why you can always draw these circles? Because the particle will always come down to the minimum distance. It has to come down. When the motion is oscillatory, when it's such a finite motion, it will always come down to that point. And then is it only that the kinetic energy will become zero, that it turns around. So the fact that it always comes down to this point, so not essentially always at the same orientation, but at this orientation, in this direction. So at various directions it can come down to the same point, and then it goes away again. Since all these points are equally distant, and that is the minimum distance, r minimum, from this point it's essentially a circle, and it can in any direction go only this far from the center, not any farther. So in all directions, this is the restriction on the motion of particle. So the particle is always restricted provided that there are two turning points in the effective motion along the r direction. The particle's entire total motion, its actual motion, is restricted between these two concentric circles, whose center lies at the origin of at the center of the given central field. The inner circle has the radius, the minimum distance the particle can come to, that is this first turning point. The outer circle, the maximum distance, that's the second turning point. And here I have showed you a kind of this precision of orbit of one kind of particle. In an arbitrary potential energy, the particle's trajectory is not closed, so it always goes such and it comes such, goes such and comes such, goes such and comes such, and it always keeps doing that. So its trajectory, this curve always precesses. How about that it comes down to this point and it meets this point again? In the general case, no, as we have shown that the integral in general case cannot be written such. So it comes to this point but misses it again, and it misses this again, and it misses this again. So not that it doesn't pass through the same r's again, not that it doesn't pass through the same phi's again, which obviously is a trivial fact that it does, but it does not in general pass through the same r and phi simultaneously. It does not in general do that. If it can be written such, delta phi is equal to 2 pi, this integral can be written as delta phi is equal to 2 pi m over n, m and n being integers. In fact, you could consider natural numbers for that matter. So what that tells you is that after, let's say, after m times that this one of these has happened, after m times that, let's say, r, the particle has passed through the same r, it could have passed through the same n. Well, what do you say, it could have passed through the same orientation, it could have passed through the same phi n times, and after this they'll finally meet again. So the r's and phi's will be same. That is when the integral can be written as such, when delta phi can be written as such. In that case, after these periods, after these so many intervals, the particles r and phi are the same. For what values of potential is this possible? Is this reduction possible? Well, I'll tell you, this is possible for, we are talking about central fields only, keep that in mind. This is possible for 1 over r square dependence and r square dependence. Not 1 over r square, it's possible for 1 over r distance and r square distance. This, you know, is the kind of dependence of potential energy on distance for planetary orbits, for gravitational interactions in general and electrostatic interactions. So in such cases, the motions really are closed. So the planetary orbits don't exactly precede, the planetary orbits don't, the motion of Earth around the Sun. So the motion of Earth around the Sun is a closed curve because it follows this dependence of potential energy on distance. Then there's also this, and you figure that, well, this thing called, I suppose, a space oscillator, or as I recall, also has similar, well, trajectories that are closed. So these trajectories don't precede around. So these are two special cases, these are two interesting cases where the trajectory of the particle under this interaction with a central field is closed. And if you consider only this case to be, well, to be no motion along phi, actually no motion, we are considering purely one-dimensional motion. So r should be only that Cartesian coordinate, and you figure this is proportional to r square, which very much looks like that of a harmonic oscillator, and then you figure a harmonic oscillator's motion is quite closed. But I think that's a trivial case, and that is only an analogy and should not be counted, because we are essentially considering whether r and phi can simultaneously be the same or not. That is when we say that the motion really is closed. And so for them to be simultaneously the same, the motion really has to be in a plane, two-dimensional. How about three-dimensional? Well, everything that we have done so far has started from the fact that the angular momentum is conserved because Noether's theorem, because central field, because isotropy of space, all directions of space with respect to this point are equivalent. And so the direction of angular momentum is conserved, and so the motion only occurs in a plane. You consider third direction, no worries, the motion will only occur in a plane. That's it. And I think that concludes our discussion of the motion of a particle in a central field, the equations we had to derive, the remarks we had to make. In the next video, we finally solve Kepler's problem, that is actually the problem of gravitational interacting bodies. Quite obviously, it's a two-body problem, and that we talk about two bodies, but we know from the previous video that two-body problem can be reduced down to the motion of a one particle in a central field, and we know from this video how we solve the central field case. That way we solve the Kepler's problem. That was all for this video of mine, and thanks to your viewers.